Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Brooks. I'm a partner and vice president of consulting, head of consulting within Org Vitality. I will be your host today, your host and fellow student. And with me today, I'm pleased to have a chat with Meghan Lowery. Meghan is a senior director of global talent science at Eli Lilly. With 12 years of experience in internal roles, external roles, and academic roles also. She's been a active member in the Mayflower Consortium, a survey consortium to share best practices and information and data with regard to employee surveys and other kinds of listening programs, including multiple board positions. And needless to say, she's got a lot of experience to share, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that. Some quick housekeeping just before we get started. This session will be recorded, and we'll make that available afterwards. Also, this will be informal, and we're going to drop away from the slides in just a minute or two. And as such, we would love it if you all submit questions as we go. We'll try to have as much time for back and forth as possible. We'll also reserve some time at the end just to get to any questions that we haven't. So, Meghan.
Thanks, Scott.
Delighted to have you here. Thanks for coming. I've known you for many years now. Yeah, this is great. So, your title is Senior Director of Global Talent Science, Assessment, Surveys, and Research. That's kind of a lot.
Isn't it?
Yeah, many syllables. Can you describe what that is? Let's say we're at a cocktail party here and you're talking to somebody who doesn't really know much about talent management.
Yeah, so first I usually start with, I'm in HR. Maybe I'll slip in, I'm in talent management. If their eyes haven't glazed over at that point, I'll then continue to say, I'm in a position where my work tries to improve the outcomes of both employees and the employer as well. So making sure people are in the right roles at the right time, they have what they need to be satisfied and engaged, and that we're trying to set them up for success so that the employer can get as much out of the investment. And we do that through a number of techniques. So measurement, research, different interventions. It's really cool work.
That sounds great. The what all does that cover? I mean, what are some of the projects that you work on?
Yeah, so it's kind of in the title, which helps give our HR business partners a hint. But I oversee our assessments that we use at Lilly, everything from any kind of pre-hire assessment that we might use. But we also focus a lot more on our developmental assessments at Lilly. So using things like instruments to help people develop in their careers and understand what might be best in their next roles. And then also we oversee all the global surveys at Lilly. So all of our census type surveys, different life cycle surveys from employee onboarding to every experience that they're having throughout to after they've left the organization, and we study, why did they leave? Was it good? Was it something that we need to improve on? Things like that. And then we take all of that data, combine it with other HR data sources, and we answer especially questions that our business partners have, especially our executive leaders, if they're wanting to study different trends and kind of answer the question, why? So we leave it to our analytics function to answer more of the who and the what and where are they going, and we answer more of the why. So that's how I would kind of describe what we do.
The why, that's great. And I like separating it from, you mentioned analytics functions and things like that. What's your relationship with an analytics function? And do you have like a specific HR analytics function, maybe a decision science people in it, or how does that work for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's evolved over the years. When I first came to Lilly in 2015, there was a little bit of a reporting function, is what we'd call it, where they were kind of studying headcount movement, and that was about it. Mm-hmm. Answering some other questions, but mainly just very descriptive reporting mode. And then myself and my boss at the time we're based in talent management, and we were the only two IO psychologists in the company. And so we did these, deep dives into data. And I think sometimes people wondered, like, what in the world are you doing? And then the proliferation of data became a lot more accessible, and just people had access to it a lot more. And so then became the need to have more people supporting that information. And so they stood up a data analytics group within HR. And so it's actually in a separate COE from where I sit. And they're really responsible for the flow of data in and out of different systems. We use human capital management system software at Lilly, of course. And so they're very responsible for that. But also, they are implementing some really cool new technologies for our HR partners to pay attention to track trends related to the workforce, because I can't be everywhere to help them out all the time. And so having access to those tools is really, really helpful for them. So that's really what they've been doing and on their growth partnership. So we tend to work together where, again, I kind of answer the why and why it's important to study and certain predictors that might be really helpful. And then they're there to supply all the data to our HR partners and anyone who else might need access to that information.
So with something like turnover, they understand, who's quitting and where are they quitting from, and, what kinds of headcount changes or recruiting, matches up against that. And you step back and you say, well, why are people quitting? Have I got that right?
Perfect. That's a great description. And
nice.
Actually, tying into kind of like an interesting trend that I've really seen. Obviously, we're all well aware of the Great Resignation trend that happened in 2020 and into 2021, right? And so one of the things that was really interesting was we have always studied attrition and retention. I shouldn't say always. We're 145 plus year old company, but at least for the past few decades, it's certainly been a topic of conversation. So it's always been there. But suddenly it rose to kind of national level attention or even global attention, right? And so people were hashtagging Great Resignation, and just all these news articles were popping up. And so it became this great conversation and curiosity at Lilly of, oh my gosh, everybody's leaving. Like, what are we going to do? And so a big part of that was, on that topic, was really educating both our business partners and also our HR business partners to say, are we really losing all that many people, or is that what you're hearing in the media, right? And so what we really kind of had to get ahead of, which I am not so sure we were successful getting ahead of it, but we tried our best, was when all that became really popular and there was kind of this sense of uncertainty and fear in our employee population about, oh my gosh, all these people are leaving. We really had to counter it and say, actually, no, there's been a slight increase in our numbers that have been leaving, but it's not, it's not all of a sudden off the chart. And even though you've had one person in your group leave, that doesn't mean everyone at the company is leaving. So let's pause and take a time out. Don't panic, right? First page of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? Don't panic.
Yeah. That's right.
Is to say, what is it that we need to do here? Do we need to intervene? That sort of thing. So our HR analytics function was really critical in helping to kind of set the stage to say, yes, here's all the data at your fingertips so you can see it and model it. And then I serve more of a kind of supportive position to say, and also based on the research, here's what we need to be paying attention to.
Right.
Yeah, that's a description.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting story, because you were talking about, the arc of studying turnover has been there for a long time. The arc of leaders' interest in turnover, spikes a little differently up and down. And even if, this is your studying of it, what has turnover really been doing? And then the interests of people. It sounds like these things don't really match. or do they? How do you balance what people are talking about versus what people should be talking about versus what you've always known, those kinds of things?
Oh my goodness. I feel like I both alternate between, it's like Groundhog Day every day, right? Where I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but then also it's a very different day every day. So, I think that's probably one of the things that's most intriguing about my role is a lot of times we have often studied it either as a field or we've studied it inside at my company, right? And now it's become the awareness, right? It's not kind of linking up. And so the awareness all of a sudden spikes and the interest in it suddenly spikes. And now we need to get resources to those people that they can understand it better. And actually recently, I was going to tell you a story. Recently, there was an opportunity I had because I was reflecting on the Great Resignation, how that had kind of come about and how it really set us back on our heels in terms of being able to quickly respond to the concern and the uncertainty, right? There was a lot of noise. And I kept thinking like, oh gosh, I wish I would have known that about the reaction that people would have had and been able to circumvent it in the first place, right? So that we kept the noise level down because the actual event wasn't that big of a deal, at least internal to our company. Sure. And so one of the things that I love to do is, I try to pay attention to all sorts of different news sources. And one of the things that I saw trending one weekend, I think it was in August, was this description of quiet quitting. I was seeing hashtag quiet quitting. Remember that one?
Yeah. Well, whenever there's an alliterative media frenzy, I always sort of, give it a little bit of this.
Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly. Yeah. So I saw that and I thought, I bet this is going to turn into the next frenzy of media in terms of what are they going to talk about next, right? And I thought, what does it mean when we say quiet quitting? And so I kind of dug a little bit deeper and there was all these, I think I saw one time there was like 600,000 mentions of quiet quitting on TikTok, right? And like, I'm not on TikTok, but I try to pay attention to what are people talking about. And so one of the things I did that Monday morning was I actually just sat down and wrote out a post of like, what are my thoughts on this? In an effort to kind of get ahead of it. Like, what would I wish leaders would know about this as they're scrolling through their news feed? In terms of, should they even be paying attention to this? Is it a cause for concern? And so I posted about it in our HR channel, in our our big global HR group. And somebody said, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. You need to post this to our Lilly Leaders Network. And so we use Yammer internally. And so I made a post on that. I just kind of copied and pasted. And basically what I was saying was, hey, here's what, is trending out in the news right now. But here's what it actually means. Quiet quitting is not new. It's just a different name, right? So old wine, new label. So it's a kind of a different twist on engagement and burnout, trend, topics like that. And there's decades of research on that, absolute decades. And so I kind of tried to frame it and give context and say, this isn't a reason to panic. And here's why it's, good to certainly acknowledge. And here's all the resources that we already have available to you internally as a leader that you can tap into to address this on your team if you think it's an issue. And so I linked it to, we have an internal engagement conversation toolkit and several other things, just to try to beat the the swell of concern that I could see our leaders probably legitimately start to question, right? So trying to stay ahead of that.
Well, that's fantastic. I think I missed that class in grad school of monitoring TikTok for emergent leadership trends.
You and me both.
Yeah, well, I think that's great. And actually stepping away from TikTok, maybe another frame to put on it is, Pascal had said that a discovery is an accident finding a prepared mind. I mean, in this case, you had a little bit of an epiphany or a connection that met up with a lot of pre-existing prep. You mentioned all the tools and things within Lilly that pre-existed, and data that pre-existed to support this. But I think maybe more importantly, it just flipped a switch in your brain, and you already had all of this mojo to bring around the topic of quitting or burnout or engagement to just, you could just sit and blast out a post, right? And so you described how that came to be, in terms of you saw this, it triggered, you wrote it, you posted it, it was popular and so forth. But is there any backstory to what inspired it? I mean, is there anything special about what you were thinking about or leaning into that made you just burst out with this?
Probably. There's always a desire to make sure that what we do is staying relevant, but probably secretly the desire, if I had to confess to it, right, is one of the things I noticed about the panic around the Great Resignation was all of a sudden, all across our businesses, people were implementing new tools and techniques to help with retention. And one of the things I noticed about that was sometimes they're not super effective, right? Because they don't, they might not be studying or even have access to at that point, but they might not be understanding the root cause of what's causing that person to turn over, right? So for instance, if someone is unhappy with their career progression, implementing like a mentoring system might help them feel better, but it's not going to address the fact that they're not developing in their career. And so a lot of times I was noticing interventions weren't actually addressing the problem, and they're costing the organization money. So if we're going to do interventions, let's make sure that they're going to be effective and actually tie back into the root cause. So we've tried to do a lot of education around that. So when I saw the quiet quitting thing going on, I was like, uh-oh, here comes all the interventions that aren't actually going to help. And as a survey professional, you'll appreciate this. We have some pretty stringent guidelines in place at Lilly about surveying, but every once in a while, people will create their own surveys. We lovingly refer to them as rogue surveys, right? But people out in the business will create their own surveys, and they'll ask things like, are you quiet quitting? Are you, is your boss mistreating you? Things like that. And I just thought, I can see it coming. So it was partly a hope that, if we can get ahead of it, we can not only help, but also prevent some of the noise and the churn from happening.
A little bit of a defensive move. A little bit of a selfish defensiveness. Yeah, no, that's great. I think, that's all there. And you didn't mention this, but I'll also have the sense that if you didn't have a certain amount of street cred within Lilly, that it's not just anybody who could blast out a post like this. It has to be from a source that people are inclined to listen to. Is that something that you thought about, in terms of how you project and how you develop an audience and trust and rapport with the people that you're trying to serve?
Well, I'd love to say I have this amazing reputation at Lilly, but I think a lot of people don't know that I exist there. So I can't get too big-headed about it. I try to stay pretty humble about that. The big thing too is I think there's this really interesting association between being really highly trained and educated on topics like this. Not necessarily quiet quitting, but like the research on engagement, right? And then also having a lot of people that are starting to touch that data and have access to it as well. One of the things that I struggled with initially when I first came to Lilly was everybody always has an opinion on HR topics, right? Because they're human, right? But I don't think I would ever put myself in a position where I put on a lab coat and I walk into one of our labs and start fussing around with molecules, right? Because that's not my space. That's not what I've trained in. But even though I have a specialty area, other people feel very empowered to talk about that specialty area as if they have the same knowledge and background, right? And so that was initially kind of hard for me to say, like, whoa, how do I distinguish myself there? And I think the key differentiator is to understand what I'm able to bring to the table versus what other people are also able to bring to the table. Because just because they don't have a degree in something related to the topic at hand doesn't mean that they don't have valuable contributions to make. And I think one of the things that that has been really empowering for me recently has just been the idea that, you know, I have to share my specialty with other people. Or I don't have to, I get to share my specialty in the turf, right? Have you ever heard of the term sharing your Legos or giving your Legos away?
Yeah, you made mention of it in the past to me. Yeah. So describe that, would you?
Yeah.
Actually, before you do, let me just mention that, you know, as we're asking each other questions, let me remind the audience here that pop a question in the chat or in the Q&A part of Zoom, and we can address those as we go. But please, so let's talk Legos.
I personally love a good Lego set. No, I was really struggling with, you know, having this kind of specialty area, but then as I was talking about earlier, kind of this democratization of data, a lot more people have access to data, including business leaders and HR partners. There's just a lot more people kind of in the fray talking about it. And I really thought, like, I'm not sure, am I bringing value anymore? Like what, how can I best position what we do to provide the most value? And I ran across an article that was written by someone that it was more intended for like startups, but she was talking about how it can be really helpful to give away your Legos. And I was like, what? And so I keep reading, and she's basically making the case to say, when you're first starting something, and she was specifically referring to a startup, but I also reflect back on like the analytics journey, right? So you're first starting something, you've got all these Legos that you've got, and you're building some really cool things. And then more and more, these people start to come to the table because you're maybe with a startup, you're hiring more and more employees. And at first you're doing 10 different jobs because you've got all these, you know, different Legos. And then as more people come to the table, they want a piece of the pie too, right? And so you need to share your Legos. And that can be really hard when you have more of a specialization in a particular area, because what happens if I give my Legos away and they build it wrong, or they come up with something entirely new, right? That can feel really scary. And so I was reflecting on that about that kind of the scarcity mindset, right? Of it doesn't do us any good to not bring people along with us. And one of the points the article was making, it's really a commentary, but they were saying, whenever you can give your Legos away to other people, it makes you reflect on what other Legos might be around you, right? So if I give my Legos to other people and say, hey, I used to be the queen of this and this kind of structure, but if I give it to you, you can build something even cooler. And oh, by the way, because I was so busy building those Legos, I didn't notice this cool pile over here. So now I can put those in front of me and turn my attention to something even better. So for instance, you know, I was very focused for a while on retention and engagement. And as more and more people have gotten interested in that topic, we're trying to upskill that in our HR partners to say, okay, everybody has access to this data. Here's your resources. Go do something about it. And in the meantime, by kind of pushing that knowledge out, I've been able to focus on something different, which now one of the cool projects I'm working on is trying to understand flexibility and understanding like how often people on site versus how often are people off site, and how does that affect their outcomes, so that we can try to give answers in an area where there's a lot of uncertainty and questions and armchair psychology going on right now.
Sure.
Right. So I think that's a really interesting concept, is bringing people along with us who may not have a background in HR at all.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because they're bringing a different perspective to the table.
Yeah. Let me break down, I think, a few things that you said and maybe probe on a couple of things. I think partly, you're concerned about people out in the world having bad surveys like, are you quiet quitting? Over focus on that is a little bit of hoarding your own Legos. B, as evident in your mouthful of a job title, you've got this much stuff to do, and this much stuff you can do, or maybe is possible to do, but you've got the bandwidth to do this much stuff. And so in a way, maximizing impact requires giving away your Legos. But how do you do that in a way where somebody doesn't just take a hammer to them or super glue or do something that sort of damages the Legos themselves, or does something completely off-road or rogue in some fashion? So, I mean, I get that part of sharing the Legos. Let me pause for a second, a little sidebar. You were talking about research on people, maybe where they work and remote and other things and all the rest. Have you come to any sort of handful of conclusions about what leaders expect about remote or hybrid or on-site work versus what the research says inside Lilly? Do you have a hit list, a favorite playlist of nuggets that you tell people when this topic comes up?
Well, there's certainly a lot of news out there right now, right? In any given site, you can see alternative opinions, and they'll, sometimes they're more or less successful, citing different research points of, well, managers hate it when employees do this, or employees hate it when employers do this, versus on flexibility and, on-site, off-site work. We don't have any formal conclusions yet about this happening at Lilly, because we're just now pulling together the data sets. So that's, more to come in a month or two. But one of the things that we have done over the course of 2020 to 2022 is we've been constantly listening to our employees through different kind of listening methodologies, some new that we hadn't tried before. And one of the big things I think that we've really tried to keep at the forefront is flexibility, and what that means is going to look different for everybody, right? So what flexibility means to one person might mean they arrive at the office a little bit later that day because they were dropping their kids off at daycare. And another, it might mean they just really don't prefer to work on afternoons, so they get up just extremely early, right? Or maybe a person just says, no, I'm going to work 4 days a week and cram all of my hours into those 4 days. It really kind of depends on the person. And one of the things that we've really tried to keep at the forefront is, because it depends on the person, we need to be really thoughtful about how that impacts people who traditionally have been kind of understudied or underserved. So it's going to impact, and this is based on previous research, but it's going to impact women differently than men, because women tend to have more, even though they may be working equally in terms of if they have a spouse at home, they both may be working full-time jobs, but the female tends to take on additional responsibilities once she's at home, right? So we know that has an impact. We also know that there are certain ethnic minority groups that have differences in how they experience the impact of flexibility or impact of working remotely. And then also we know that employees with disabilities have differences in how they work, right? And how they're positively impacted by enhanced flexibility. So that's one of the things that we've just tried to keep top of mind as we implement policies and procedures, kind of, is just recognize, don't make a blanket policy in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, figuring that stuff out for the United States is hard enough, but any kind of global stirring of the pot of gender dynamics and family and child rearing practices, it's like, oh goodness, we should all just go home and watch TikTok, right?
I think that might be easier.
Yeah, you think so? Back to this idea of sort of Legos and things like that. Your job encompasses a lot of things. Are there some parts where sharing the Legos is easier, or the armchair psychologist forces on the other side are a little different?
Recorded.
Apologies, everybody. I am making up. Oh, there you go.
There we go. Briefly interrupted.
Shall I repeat the question? Did you catch it?
So you were saying about sharing your Legos, and are certain Legos, are they easier to share than others, right?
Well, certain parts of your job, the Legos for those parts, like selection testing versus survey versus leadership development. Are there some domains like that, some topic areas where the grabbiness of everybody else to run off with your Legos is a different force, or what? How even is that across the different parts of your job?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's so much technical components to some of it, right? So for instance, things like pre-employment assessments and selection, or internal selection assessments. There's due diligence that has to be done, and statistical analyses and things like that. Those are obviously things that we partner with our privacy office and our HR legal offices to make sure that we are following the appropriate protocols, and because there's legal guidance in place, right? So those are things that we can't just punt off. But but in terms of making sure that people are skilled in interpretation and intervention levels, I think, or it's interventions that they can do, I think those are appropriate things to certainly bring more people to the table. But when it comes to maybe studying employment outcomes and decisions around employment outcomes, that's where we have to be more careful, and sometimes simply acknowledging that there's that legal risk, or the harm that could come from it being done wrong, is where we say, these are the Legos you can't play with. And sometimes those aren't my Legos to begin with, right? Those are different areas that own those. But I think that's kind of the concept that we try to follow, is what's going to keep, first, do no harm, right? So keep everybody safe, and including employees and the employer.
Yeah,
Sure.
and you mentioned legal, but I imagine there's also plenty of policy issues surrounding privacy, or the treatment of employee data, or anonymity rules, or other kinds of things that are sort of inherent in much of what we do. Yeah. So we have a couple of questions. Let me just read one. And this I think is related to the conversation we were just having. What strategies do you use to help make non-IOs and maybe non-HR experts feel like they have a say without letting them run amok?
I love that. I think there's kind of like what I was sharing earlier about, here's what you might be hearing out in the world. and here's the data to go look at, and here's some guidance in the interpretation of that data, right? So kind of supplying the appropriate sources of data, making sure that you have the guidance and the guardrails as necessary, right? Sure. You're going to, depending on the topic, those are going to differ. And then helping them to understand what are the appropriate levels of interventions that might be helpful. Right? So what's an organizational level intervention versus an individual level intervention, and managers and teams, because that's going to differ, where someone that's supporting a function somewhere isn't going to do an organizational level intervention, but they're certainly going to be the beneficiary of it and helping to support that.
Are there any domains of your job where this is not a problem, where people just don't want to run amok and they say, fine, you do it? Or is there running amokness everywhere?
I mean, there's always a little bit of running amok, right? It wouldn't be fun without it. I would say in general, once we put up the kind of the warning flag of, hey, this is actually either protected by a particular law or there's guidance in place that we have to follow. Once we make people aware of that, they tend to be way more cautious about it, and they can kind of understand, oh, here's why we don't, post survey results raw up for everybody to see. Okay, I get that, right? So I think that's probably anywhere where there's a little bit more guidance, either privacy or legal or something other than that. It just even ethical. I think that there's definitely caution more people are willing to take.
Yeah. I think one of the issues that you're sort of touching on here is that, we're trained as industrial and organizational psychologists, right? And all of the training is about creating a deliverable, right? Having a selection test that's fair and valid, having a survey that measures what you think it will, and so forth and so on. But all these deliverables that sit in your center of excellence, and then just sort of you release them into the organization, and the ultimate effectiveness of them depends on other people's use of the deliverables, right? How they
absolutely.
And I think a survey is a terrific example where it's like you do everything you can to make it so easy for somebody to read and understand some results and maybe take some action, or at least have a conversation with their group. And so you have all these tools and other things and cajoling and maybe a little bit of arm twisting, but in the end, it depends on other people using your stuff, right? And so in the end, I think it's whether you build a glorious castle out of your Lego and then hand it off, or just give people pieces. In the end, everything you do is to give to somebody else. Is that a fair statement? Or are there some things where you just sort of build it and it just sort of cooks in its own black box somewhere?
Oh man. I think there's a few examples, but in general, if we know it's going to affect a lot of people, right? So our entire employee population, or a huge chunk of them, there's always a design team that's working behind the scenes to make it as perfect as we can get it. And then yes, it relies really strongly on that strong partnership with our HR partners to actually implement it and do how it's implemented so that it's designed to work the way it's supposed to. And the way that we've been successful at this, and I don't profess to say we're successful all the time with every single program. We're not. Some of them kind of epically fail because of the implementation phase. But I have one assessment.
Did you say epically fail?
Epically fail, right? Where
not ethically, but epically.
Epic failure.
Yeah, nice.
It's more like we've designed it so perfectly, and then we hand it off, or we're not good about communicating about the handoff, and we say, here it is, and then no one uses it, which is just, it makes me want to cry at night, right? So my work, we've really been trying to concentrate on how we can make a perfect castle, right? But how do we then hand it over in a way that's going to be the most successful? And that's really hard to do, actually.
It is.
one thing that we've been pretty successful at is one particular assessment that we use for development and the implementation of it. And we've done all sorts of research on it. But one of the things that has been really helpful is we've paid attention to the launch activities locally to make sure that we were paying attention to the noise. So we were doing immediate surveys. We were listening to our HR partners to see where is it starting to maybe crumble a little bit so that we can immediately, fix it and move on versus watching it epically fail and wonder what happened. So I think that kind of that early intervention is something that we've seen a lot of success with, for sure.
That's great. And I think pulling back on some threads that you dropped earlier in the conversation with the sort of HR analytics and people that are the what and you're the why. A thought that I've been smitten with lately is dashboards don't create change, people do, right? Yes. And that sort of, and anybody can make a dashboard and have numbers and you say, hey, these are the right numbers. And you say, okay, fine, I trust it and whatever. But then you start to say why, which is your job. And I think the why is important to create. You're also talking about underlying causes and fixing the right problem and so forth and so on. And all of that requires the why. But then the armchair psychologist and quarterbacking comes in where people say, I don't think that's why, or I can go off and do something faster than you can because science is using historic data to test theories to, make predictions about the future, right? And it's that can be a little slow for some people and some of the time, but this is your Lego transfer is harder than an HR metrics person because they can just sort of they build something to a recipe. Here's the recipe. Here it is. There you go. They're not trying to create a backstory of the why, I think. And so,
well, I think that's where that good partnership comes into play, right? Yeah. Because I'm not going to be successful if our partners don't have access to information, which is what our data and analytics group really supplies to them. And I'm not going to be trusted if that data is not right. So that's a big part of their job, making sure that the quality is there. And you're absolutely right. And I love the word smitten, by the way, about dashboards versus actually taking action. There's what I've really noticed as we've democratized data and we've made it more accessible is if you don't have a background in data and analytics, all of that data can feel so overwhelming to people, almost enough where they don't want to go and access it, right? And we've been talking about this kind of continuum of our HR partners where some are extremely skilled. They are just there and they're analyzing and they're delivering and doing beautiful work. And then there's people who don't want to open the platform and they feel intimidated at Excel documents and things like that. And then there's people all throughout the middle, right? So how do we target the people that don't even want to open the portal to look at the data because they're afraid they might break it, right? To the people that are highly influential with their data and are great partners in that regard. How do you upskill that entire continuum? That's really the struggle that we're working with, right? It's not a struggle. It's more just an interesting challenge that we're working with right now.
Well, it is. And
I don't know if somebody's succeeded at it.
Well, but I think you're helping to frame the questions and some of the challenges. And one of the things you alluded to is upskilling certainly and making sure people know certain things or think certain ways, like whether it's about legal issues or proper interpretation of the data or anything like that. But I think that you also talk about being overwhelmed with data, with democratization of the data. And another sort of nugget or thought I've been smitten with lately is it used to be true that what gets measured gets done. But now with so much measurement happening everywhere, I think that's transformed to be, what stays on my radar gets done. And it opens the door for framing or reducing cognitive load, and these are, whether you think a behavioral economic nudge is a coherent topic or not, these are psychological ways to help deal with overload, or help motivation match, ambition for people. I mean, everybody wants to improve, but how do you draw that out of them and serve it up in a way that they're not overwhelmed by clicking on the portal or risking to break something? I like that.
Well, and I was reflecting on the title of this fireside chat, right? About like, how do you prioritize all these metrics and organizational research? And I think really what we've tried to do, and one of my colleagues to tell me whether or not we've been successful at this, but at least it's been an intent, right? Is we try to be simultaneously connected to the business to understand what are they actually asking about, what's on the top of their mind, so that it just drops it in front of them to say, oh, we know that you're already looking at or concerned about attrition. Here it is. You don't have to go searching for it. Here it is. So trying to anticipate those things, but then also understand what might be coming to them in terms of thinking, 3 to 6 months or even more if you can, but what's going to be coming up soon for them that they're going to start to get concerned about with the next cycle of whatever they're dealing with, so that you're already preparing the data so that they're not waiting on you, right? So kind of that just in time. I think that's what's really a really cool challenge.
Do you have an ideal example about that? Because I know it's easy to just respond to existing requests versus anticipate future needs, which is kind of what you just articulated. Yeah,
I mean, just the recent one that we have been kind of gathering the data on, and it's been a little bit slower than we anticipated initially, but just kind of knowing that. So for instance, for Lilly, although people were certainly on site during the pandemic because we make medicine and we have to have people making the medicine, but in terms of like knowledge workers, everyone was finally invited back onto site officially in March of 2022. And so now we're at about the 6-7 month mark, and we know our employees and our business leaders are starting to ask the question, so what does this mean? What's the outcome? And we need to be able to respond to that. And so back in August, I started to kind of plan out, here's the research questions that I'm wanting to be able to answer come September, October. And so we're currently working on that right now, which, I don't have any cool results to share with you, maybe the next fireside chat, right? But
yeah, let's do that.
But that's the kind of thing that you want to be thoughtful about is, well, given, X was implemented then, what are they going to be thinking about in 5 or 6 months? And can I beat them to the punch of asking the question? That makes it feel really relevant. So that's what I try to do.
Yeah. I know we've covered a lot of ground in a lot of ways, but some of the themes that keep popping out to me are regarding, building relationships with your customers so you can anticipate their needs, trying to look at what they're looking at, not just stay inside your own, research cave, trying to implement some smart guardrails, but at the same time, release the Legos into the world with a certain amount of upskilling, or probably just some leap of faith, just like, I'm going to do this, sort of see what happens. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Meghan, I want to come back to, some of your, 2-3 nuggets that you might have of advice to leave people with. But let's look at some of the questions. I know that we've touched on or alluded to a bunch of these. Here's one. Somebody actually gives their name. So, hello, Casey from Target here. Do you have any tips? Yeah, there's Casey. Do do you have any tips for the very beginning stages of sharing the sentiment Lego with data analytics and reporting functions, specifically doing so in a way that leads to appropriate use, interpretation, and ultimately build trust and efficacy between the two functions over time? So that's maybe not sharing your Lego with managers at large or HR at large, but a specific collaboration.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a little bit of a different spot at Lilly, but I think the biggest thing is kind of having both parties put on their consultative hat and ask, what is it that we're trying to solve? And then work backwards, right? So instead of starting with, here's immediately what we're going to share, because that can feel very tension focused. And instead ask the question, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve mutually? What are we both going to get out of this, or multiple parties? And then how can we work together to understand our final outcome? I think that will usually solve a lot of tensions. And also, something I've had to learn a lot is remind myself about is you're all working for the same company. You're all trying to achieve the same objective, right?
Yeah.
You're just coming at it from different perspectives. And I think that recognizing that and reminding yourself of that can be really helpful because you're all on the same team. Really.
Yeah. I mean, well, so true. If in my next fireside chat, I would have one of your colleagues sitting there from data science or analytics. And if I were to ask them, who answers the why questions or who does the what and the who questions, would they say kind of the same things you would? Or is this a frame that's been in your head and not overtly discussed?
I would hope that they would. I mean, we definitely share more of a partnership, and it's an early partnership, right? That group has not been around for a long time. So we're still kind of navigating like who answers what question and how who has access to what at which times and what levels of permissions do different people have. But the good news is we're all trying to solve the same problems. It's just, I mean, I think that they probably would have at least some of the same perspective. I think it's been discussed somewhat. And I've certainly got people that I work with a lot and then people who I intermittently work with. So the people that I work with a lot, I think would probably provide the same kind of answer for sure.
That's interesting. I sometimes think about this as this, data science, and then we're behavioral science, right? And data science is all about the data and the prediction and the arrangements and stuff like that. Behavioral science is all about creating change. And yet to the rest of the world, they don't draw a distinction between these, halves of the yin and the yang.
And for the longest time, IO psychologists were kind of it in organizations. It didn't become until recently where data science really became popular or really relevant. So the psychologists were the ones running the analyses and doing whenever I explain that I have a stats background to people, they're like, wait, what? I thought you were an organizational psychologist. What are you talking about?
Yes. And how do you feel about that?
Yes. Yeah. I thought that there was you have to explain no, there is a data science component to it. It's just now I feel like our data science colleagues have really robust training in it where I had some training in it, right? So they're coming at it with a different lens entirely.
Right.
And so I kind of say as subject matter experts, they're coming in with all these new methodologies and tricks of the trade up their sleeves, right? And then there's also kind of this IT component of it where you've got to flood that data into the right place and have the infrastructure in place so that everybody who consumes the information has it to begin with. And so when you can develop that partnership between the SME and then the data scientist and the IT setup, I think that's where the magic happens. And if our HR partners or our business leaders don't understand how to make that distinction, I actually don't think it matters because it's the end product that matters. But as long as we're clear on our roles, we're good. But all three have to be at the table, I think.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good tripod. The Another question that's out here. Hopefully, Casey, you're satisfied with that answer for now, at least. What exciting projects can you tell us that you're looking forward to in your role? Anything fun you haven't gotten to do previously?
We were about to start this and then we kind of paused it. We have a new CHRO coming on board soon. And so one of the things that we were about to start doing, and I think we're, probably going to do it in the near future, is to study our entire employee experience all at once. We have a tendency to kind of study things in either silos or depending on different areas at different times. And one of the things that we've done over time at Lilly has been what we call the employee journeys. And so we've studied women, we've studied Asian Americans, we've studied Latinx, we've studied our Black population, we've studied our LGBTQ population. We're about to start a big study on employees with disabilities. And so that is amazing because we're able to narrow in on each kind of subpopulation and understand their tensions. But with understanding the entire employee experience, not from a value proposition, but more from what are people experiencing from the moment they start to the moment that they exit or retire, where are kind of universal tensions at so that we can intervene on those appropriately. We do study those moments in time. Like we might say, oh, we know that we have a bit of a retention issue for this population at this time in tenure. So we're going to intervene and study on that. But we haven't pulled back and really done a big overview in quite some time. So that's what we're kind of gearing up to do soon.
Yeah. So sounds like you're chasing the grand unified theory of employee experience.
Exactly.
And if that's a roller coaster for everybody through their tenure, you've looked at different cars so far, different arcs or loops, but not the whole process. I'm also very intrigued by that when you sort of pull back, and if using this roller coaster analogy, you've got a roller coaster with lots of cars going on all at once, and it's this grand flow, not single set of moments. Because at any point in time in Lilly, you've got 10,000 moments going on of this type, just right now. And you got people hiring and people quitting, all the time. So there's a flow management kind of thing to deal with. So let me bring this a little bit to a close, and I'll give you the last word for advice and nuggets for people. But I think we've covered, you've got a big job and your work is dependent on others taking your Legos and doing something constructive with it, and their interests and skills and armchair psychologist qualities, they all matter. And you're trying to balance the why behind it all and help them create change. That's kind of what I'm picking up from this. And it sounds like you've got a great fun job with a great charter, and you found ways to have some great impact. But let me leave you with the last. Yeah, right. So are you an engaged employee? Maybe this right here can be a moment that matters. So if you had a couple of nuggets to leave people with in the last minute here, what would you say?
Well, I think the big thing is, it's a big responsibility to try to drive a lot of different things all at once. And so what kind of calms me down and focuses me is trying to be 1% better every day, right? So I might not be able to deliver everything every single day, but if I can drive a project 1% forward today, it's going to be 1% even better the next day, right? So that's a big philosophy I try to remember when I'm getting discouraged about the amount and breadth of what we're trying to accomplish. And the second thing is that I love, and I've always told this to graduate students and to fellow professionals and things like that, is, be disruptive in your thinking. And the way that I personally do this is I like to follow people on social media and LinkedIn and people like that, that I disagree with. So
Ooh.
I, of course, surround myself with people that I agree with and that I like to follow their work, but I also try to follow people who I vehemently oppose and I disagree with firmly, so that I can at least see their perspective, so that I can be better at talking about mine and equipping others about the right kinds of resources and things like that. So that's what I like to do.
Well, that's great. And that's wisdom beyond talent management or IO or anything like that.
Sure.
I want to thank you so much, Meghan, for joining. I think it's been wonderful to chat with you. I'm sure the audience felt the same. Yeah. And I want to remind people that this is just one in amongst a series of fireside chats. Last week was Alan Church, and that recording is already available. But coming up, Caterpillar, MyTech, and Dell, with some fascinating conversations to come. So some of that will be available to anybody who wants to register. So thanks, Meghan. Delightful. And I think I will see you next week.
See ya. Thanks,
All right.
Scott.
Yep. Bye-bye, everybody.